The following announcement was issued by Royal Communications on the 8th of September 2022. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow.
The newly declared King Charles III says, "The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of great sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms, and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held."
Today, we are interrupting our usual programming to bring you breaking history. The longest reigning British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, has died at age 96, leaving her eldest son Charles to ascend the British throne. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, born April 21, 1926, reigned as Queen of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth realms for 70 years, 214 days.
The longest of any British monarch, and the longest recorded of any female head of state, ever.
Erica, do you know who is the one monarch in history that ruled longer than her 70 years, 214 days?
Indeed I don't.
You don't?
Indeed I don't. Mm-mm.
He will actually be featured on this podcast next week. The Sun King, center of his own universe, Louis XIV of France, who ruled for 72 years, 110 days.
I have no
It feels fitting.
Really? Because I have no positive response to that.
The man thought the whole world revolved around him. He was the center of his universe.
Now I'm just really wishing she could have just held on.
Yeah, it would have been nice.
The Sun King?
The
like,
Sun
really?
King. He literally is the longest documented reigning monarch.
Jeez.
And really, to get to 70 plus years, you've got to start pretty young.
Right.
So actually, she lived to be older, if that makes you feel better.
It does, but it is...
Because he took over at 4, so it's kind of like cheating.
It's not a huge comfort.
Okay.
But it's not nothing.
I'll take that.
It's not nothing.
All right, back to the matter at hand.
Mm-hmm.
With Queen Elizabeth II's passing, it is the end of an era. A very long era. And we, at the Pithy Chronicle, wanted to commemorate her remarkable reign with a special episode.
And usually we do like to roast our podcast subjects.
I do love some sarcasm.
But today is not the day for that.
Fine. Yes.
Today,
Agreed.
Carolina and... ish. There are definitely some spicy comments. Don't think this is going to be...
It will not be boring.
It will not be boring.
Tampon Gate will make an appearance.
Unfortunately. I did... but whatever.
That's so weird.
It is still so weird to me. But today, Caroline and I are proud to present our very official top 10 list for Queen Elizabeth II.
We are going to give the briefest of bios.
The flashiest of flashes.
Excellent. Thank you, Rowan Atkinson, CBE.
It has been a hot minute since I've watched Love Actually.
That's fair.
Followed by our personal top 10 highlights from Elizabeth's reign.
On her 21st birthday, Elizabeth broadcast live to the entire world from South Africa, saying, quote, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service."
And I think it is a safe assumption to say she probably did not anticipate quite how long her life and service would be.
And with that, let's begin.
Hey y'all, I'm Erica.
And I'm Caroline. And we are the Pithy Chronicle.
History with a bite.
Are you hungry yet?
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born
What
on
a name.
What a name, and we're going to go through it. She was born in 1926, the same year that A.A. Milne published Winnie the Pooh. Her father was the second son of King George V, and her mother was from a pretty prestigious family, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. She was the first royal born via C-section. How lovely.
Oh.
And she was the last one born in the presence of the Home Secretary.
What?
Yes, so after...
I guess after the whole baby swap controversy, I could see why it would be important to have government officials witness the birth, to, confirm.
They literally did that through the 30s, just to make sure that the birth wasn't tampered with.
Well.
And evidently Elizabeth II actually intended to have her own children's births witnessed, but she was basically told they'd have to invite way too many people because everybody wanted to watch that? Question mark?
Honestly, no thank you.
It's like Emma Thompson said in Bridget Jones's Diary 3. My husband said it was like watching his favorite pub burn down. Yes.
No need for an audience for that.
So Charles did not have an audience for his birthing, but Elizabeth did.
She was named Elizabeth after her mother, Alexandra after her great-grandmother, wife of Edward VII, who had died 6 months earlier, and Mary after her grandmother, the current queen, wife to George V. And tabloids absolutely went crazy upon her birth. While her father was not the next in line, his brother, the future Edward VIII, was unmarried, had no children, so she still represented the next generation of the monarchy.
I read one article that claimed her first word was ta-ta, which I highly struggled to believe, but I want to all the same, so we're going to go with that. As a young child, she was described by Churchill, who met her when she was just 2 years old, as, quote, quite a character with an air of authority astonishing in an infant. Her paternal grandfather, King George V, was very taken with her. While he was a very hard father, I think he was quite a soft grandfather.
Absolutely fantastic.
His only requirement was that she have nice handwriting. He called her Lilibet, which we have now seen come back with Harry and Meghan's daughter, and she referred to him as Grandpa England, which I think is adorable.
I like to think my child has rather an astonishing air of authority for an infant as well.
That your 10-month-old?
Yeah, but she also does not have a country to rule over eventually. That I know of.
No.
That I know of. Now, Elizabeth, on the other hand, was a shy child who, like her father, felt a very strong sense of duty. She also, evidently, had a bit of OCD, and it's not a terrible trait for a budding monarch. I mean, you gotta have a lot of fires burning.
Yeah, I think that actually could help her. Her sister Margaret was born 4 years later in 1930, and as we'll discuss later, she was a very different person. Together, they were absolutely yin and yang, and they did make a very capable pair.
The family called themselves We Four and lived a very happy family life. Their mother, Elizabeth, was determined to give them a traditional, familial upbringing. She didn't encourage studiousness, preferring play. Mom and governess often butted heads about the amount of schoolwork. For example, Elizabeth's mom thought starting school before 11 a.m. was a bit too excessive, and I have to agree with her.
It's the next possible Queen of England. I feel that she should go to school for more than an hour and a half a day, but whatever.
But if I could not do things until 11, fine.
I could do that. Considering that I wake up at 4 to record these, I would prefer 11. But life changed forever with the abdication crisis. When George V died, her uncle David became King Edward VIII. However, he was desperately in love with an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. And if this doesn't harken back to the divorcee of Meghan Markle, I don't know what does. And the government could not accept her as a queen. And so for love, Edward gave up his right to the throne. All of a sudden, Elizabeth's father was now unexpectedly King George VI. Elizabeth and Margaret weren't thrilled by this. They had to leave their comfortable home, which I'm sure was grand all the same, for the stuffiness of Buckingham Palace. And this also meant Elizabeth was almost guaranteed to follow in her father's footsteps. Unless, of course, she had a brother, but fortunately for feminist history, she did not.
She did not. And that tradition continued up until
2013.
Yeah.
They finally made it that if Prince George had been a girl, she'd have ruled. But no.
It is strictly
Birth order.
absolute primogeniture.
None of this male-female nonsense.
Her father ruled as king throughout World War II, and Elizabeth followed world events very closely. The government wished to remove the princess from England and have them safely in Canada, but the royal family refused.
Part of the Commonwealth.
I know, but still, kind of random.
I think it was the furthest away from the action, where they still spoke the same language.
Yeah, fair. During the war, Elizabeth began to take on more public engagements and even joined in the war effort.
In 1944, she was made a Counselor of State, and when King George VI went abroad to visit the troops in Italy, she effectively acted as regent at just 18.
Dang.
Right? In 1947, Elizabeth married Prince Philip, the fourth son of George I of Greece, though genetically definitely not Greek.
And honestly, Philip deserves his own episode because his childhood was absolutely crazy.
Born on a kitchen table as they were trying to escape Greece because the monarch that they'd brought in, they didn't like anymore. Oh my lord.
Didn't he escape in an orange crate or something wild like that?
He did. But you know what? Today is not about him.
It is
I
not.
have to remember that we have to stay on subject. Right? After their marriage, which we're going to discuss later, they moved to Malta for a time and lived a pretty traditional Navy life. He was in the Navy, she was a Navy wife.
Something we know a little bit about. Obviously, he got ceremonial titles.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
A year after the wedding, they welcomed Charles, and then 2 years after that came Anne. In 1951, as the king's health declined, the Act of Succession was drafted, just in case. And in 1952, the couple went on tour of the Commonwealth, and it had only just begun. The couple was in Kenya when King George VI died in his sleep on February 6th, 1952.
Elizabeth became the first to accede to the throne while abroad, since George I in 1714, because he was actually a distant German Hanoverian cousin.
Yep, after Charles II, they were stuck.
Yeah. Her entourage was concerned she would find out first thing when she woke up and turned on the radio, so they had a servant sneak into their bedroom and take out the radio, just in case. Philip was told first, and then he broke the news to Elizabeth.
She actually apologized for ruining everyone else's trip because they now had to return right away to England, which is just such a female thing to do, to be like, I'm so sorry that my father died and I've ruined your vacation.
Yeah. The coronation followed 16 months later, which we're going to discuss in our top 10, but it was the first ever televised coronation and was actually recorded in 3D for reasons I really don't understand. I didn't even know they had that technology, quite frankly.
I didn't either. I was shocked by this little tidbit, and I don't understand why. But there you go.
Very excitingly, as Elizabeth herself said, quote, "The ceremonies you have seen today are ancient, and some of their origins are veiled in mists of the past, but their spirits and their meanings shine through the ages, never perhaps more brightly than now." I mean, it is 3D.
Mm-hmm.
"I have in sincerity pledged myself to your service, as so many of you are pledged to mine. Throughout all of my life, and with all my heart, I shall strive to be worthy of your trust," unquote. What a statement.
Loved that. I think it was such a beautifully worded, veiled in the mists of the past. Yes, please.
I'll take that, please.
Post-coronation, Elizabeth enjoyed a lot of popularity. In 1957, she continued to embrace modernity, giving the first ever televised Christmas speech.
Many called it the new Elizabethan age, comparing the dainty and young 5'4" monarch alongside her famous ancestor.
However, Elizabeth herself wasn't really thrilled with that comparison. Quote, "Frankly, I do not myself feel at all like my great Tudor forebearer, who was blessed with neither husband nor children, who ruled as a despot and was never able to leave her native shores."
Holy cow, what a statement.
Burn!
A despot?
I was a little surprised by that one. I was like, I don't know, compared to some of her other forebears, could have been worse.
I know.
Could have been worse.
Elizabeth I, according to Elizabeth II, was evil, barren, and unloved, and untraveled, so not cosmopolitan either. So.
You know what? Good point. She was so uncosmopolitan as well. It's not like there was airfare back then.
No, but you should be crossing that English Channel left, right, and center.
To be fair, she never even went to France, and she did claim to be Queen of France. Because they all did, up until George.
They all did.
So she and Philip embarked on another goodwill tour after her coronation, and she became the first monarch, which she's clearly very proud of her travels, to visit Australia and New Zealand. No other monarch had actually been there before. She was so wildly popular that 3/4 of the adult population of Australia were said to have seen her in person.
Holy cow.
Which, when you think about how big Australia is, even though the population is smaller than the US, it's about the same size. And 2/3 of the New Zealand population also got to see her.
Wow.
And this was all very important, but time-consuming. She traveled something like 10,000 miles in order to give her subjects a personal connection. While we today might not understand the need to see her in person, although the people lining up for her funeral procession obviously disagree, back then, with so few photographs and no social media, catching even a glimpse was rare, and she understood from a very early age that her role as queen was to be visible to her people.
Yes, and at this point in British history, the monarchy's power was minimal. As a figurehead, therefore, she needed to retain her relevance through personal connection and national identity.
Mm-hmm.
But don't get us wrong, troubles were brewing. Her relationship with Philip was a challenging one. They were both very traditional in their views on family and gender, yet their roles were completely switched for official duties.
Philip, for instance, assumed that their children would be Mountbattens, his newly assumed last name, because his first one was far too German. However, that would literally change the name of the whole dynasty, and then the Windsors would be no more. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth's mom, also named Elizabeth for confusion's sake, was very upset by this, and Churchill, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was also pretty concerned.
And in the end, Elizabeth, the Queen, felt pulled in two different directions. She wanted to uphold familial tradition, but she also wanted to represent dynastic stability. The children wound up being Windsors, not Mountbattens, much to Philip's frustration. Quote, "I'm just a bloody amoeba. I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his last name to his children," unquote. But she did end up quietly in the 60s changing that up.
Did she? I didn't know that.
They are Mountbatten Windsors now.
Oh, yeah, but the dynasty's Windsor.
Oh, yeah, the dynasty stays Windsor.
After this difficulty, Philip embarked on a 6-week tour around the Commonwealth aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, which you can actually tour in Edinburgh. And I have been fortunate enough to actually go on it twice. And I took tea in the sunroom.
That's awesome.
And let's just say, it's Trey Fance. Especially when you consider how many modern amenities it had for something in the 50s at the time. It was on point.
Yeah.
It's a little old school now, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, but we love old school.
We do, obviously.
Obviously. We
like the old things.
We have a history podcast.
Da-da-da.
But while the palace denied any rift in the marriage publicly, which is always a little like,
Yeah, they actually made a statement. There is no problem in their marriage. That just invites
speculation.
comment.
Yeah.
And the press.
They really didn't like Philip. He wasn't what they looked for or wanted in a prince consort. He once commented, quote, "The press have turned us into a soap opera," unquote. Oh my God.
To which I reply, oh my God, yes, please. What channel? Another personal struggle for Elizabeth came with Princess Margaret's love life.
And there was a lot of love and a lot of life.
That's a great way to say it. If their life were to become a soap opera, frankly, Margaret would have been the lead role.
I don't know. I still maintain that she is the really exciting B character that winds up being more beloved than the main character.
I just think Elizabeth didn't have a lot of interesting. There was some scandal, but Margaret was all scandal.
Oh, she was all scandal all the time.
If you're making a soap opera, scandal sells. Anyway, Margaret was an absolute tabloid's dream. Personality-wise, she was the opposite of her shy, traditional sister. She was outgoing. She loved to be on the stage, wanted to be the center of attention, and really loved a good party. In the early 1950s, the very young Margaret fell in love with Peter Townsend, a World War II fighter pilot who was 16 years her senior and a divorcee. He also worked for her father.
Margaret was desperately in love and desperate to marry him. However, Elizabeth, and even more so, the establishment, or the firm as it's now referred to, were not cool with the relationship. The accession crisis was still in recent memory, and the idea of third in line for the throne wishing to marry a divorced commoner it was too close for comfort. It was way too similar.
Too close for comfort.
Yeah, I read that some members of parliament threatened to resign if she was allowed to go through with the wedding, which seems a bit extreme to me, but hey, what do I know? I don't have a seat in parliament.
I don't understand why you would resign your position because
in parliament,
a woman who's not going to be queen.
It's
very
weird.
odd. In the end, Elizabeth did not give her consent. She was really torn. While King George VI allowed her to marry for love to a man that the government was suspicious of and her own mother didn't really like, Elizabeth was not willing to let her sister do the same.
Who, by the way, 3 of his sisters were married to high-ranking Nazis.
Yes, it was not a good look.
It was not a great match.
No.
By any means.
No. Not to mention third cousins.
Yeah.
Margaret would have to wait till she turned 25 and reached her majority, and then she could marry without royal approval in a civil wedding.
And that also is a precedent set from the 18th century or the 1700s. So, on the day of her 25th birthday, the press stalked Balmoral, waiting anxiously for the princess's decision. In the end, she decided not to marry him. Instead, she married a photographer who became Lord Snowdon in 1960. Though their tumultuous relationship ended in divorce 18 years and 2 kids later.
In 1956, Britain's place at the top of the food chain was challenged. Egyptian leader Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, which was and still is the most widely used trade route between Europe and Asia. Prime Minister Eden, the French government, and the Israeli government plotted against the Egyptian president. They decided that Israel would attack Egypt as a pretext for England to swoop in and, just secure the canal just to make sure everything was okay and everyone was safe.
Initially, the plan sort of worked out, but soon things started to fall apart. America didn't support this action at all, and when Parliament learned that Eden had lied to them, he lost the support of his own party.
Oops.
And in the end, Eden was forced to resign, and Britain was forced to pull out of Egypt, revealing the British weakness after the war. For the first time in Elizabeth's reign, England had sincerely lost face in the international arena.
As a young monarch, she also struggled with the Old Boys Club. She was a small young woman, and most of her advisors, most members of Parliament, most of her entourage were old men who just didn't know what to do with this young queen. She occasionally found herself dragged into the political back and forth, which was most definitely not where she should be.
It sounds a whole lot like a young Queen Victoria.
I agree. And I think that you could argue it's less gender than it is age. A green monarch who's just learning the role would obviously struggle with finding their balance and their place, especially when they're surrounded by lifelong politicians. We see that in almost every accession to the throne. New leaders need time to cement their power base and to decide whom they can trust.
In the 1960s, rock and roll arrived. The world was changing, and while the hip Margaret was able to adapt, the very much more traditional Elizabeth struggled.
Yes.
The young generation and its new ideas were completely at odds with the traditionalist in Elizabeth. She was out of touch in the public's mind, and they started to see her as firmly entrenched with the establishment. And this came to a head in the 70s when the civil list, i.e., royals who get paid to be royal by the government, came under review. Inflation meant that the royal family was going into the red. Basically, they could not balance the books.
Philip, in his usual role as a troublemaker, went on TV and said, quote, "I don't know. We may have to move into smaller premises. For instance, we had a small yacht, which we had to sell, and I shall have to give up polo fairly soon."
Yes, problems of an everyman.
Exactly. Some Manchester dockers agreed and actually took up a humorous collection offering to buy the impoverished prince a polo pony.
Excellent.
Prime Minister Wilson's Labour government, similar to the British people, weren't all that sympathetic to the insanely rich royals. The Queen at this point was the richest person in the country, and she didn't have to pay any income tax or death duties, so the wealthiest person in the land was kind of complaining that the everyday people needed to help uphold their yacht and polo lifestyle.
Yeah, and PR-wise, that's just not a good look. And
no,
I understand that Prince Philip had a very certain type of personality, that usual straightforward, but it unfortunately comes off super snooty and highfalutin, and it just didn't help at all.
No. The Queen eventually did form a good relationship with Harold Wilson, which was her first ever working class prime minister. And he was a big supporter of the monarchy, and that allowed them to resolve this civil list situation, and it helped the Queen to find a good footing in the modern world and in this new, more difficult economy.
So now, current King Charles, one of the biggest moments in his life happened in 1969. He was invested as Prince of Wales. Originally, there was some concern over a nationalist uprising. Bombs were even discovered. But in the end, it was a great success, managing to feel at once personal, yet international, intimate, and yet immense. And so then the decades turned. The 70s brought more economic problems, unfortunately, including 16% inflation and 1.5 million people unemployed.
Not good.
The monarchy at this time became concerned that they didn't have the people's hearts and minds. So to celebrate 25 years on the throne, a silver jubilee was planned, but there were real fears about indifference. People were really worried.
Public indifference. They thought, yeah, this was one of the times when why do we need a monarchy started to kind of bubble up. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Sex Pistols rolled out a punk hit of their own version of God Save the Queen that year that charted to #1 on every list except the BBC's official one because they didn't want that to be the #1. It wasn't uber flattering. And the following year, Margaret's tumultuous marriage imploded. Both parties had been unfaithful. Margaret, in fact, was rumored to have been good friends with Mick Jagger.
Oh, wink, wink, punch, punch. The 80s brought the monarchy back into the hearts of the British people. First, there was a bizarre instance when a man found his way into the Queen's bedroom, and she awoke to him just like hanging out in her room.
Hanging out.
He says they were silent, but other stories say she spoke calmly to him while pushing the silent alarm button. But in the end, no one was harmed, and the palace staff offered him a cigarette and a drink.
I'd need a cigarette and a drink, knowing I was going to jail for having found my way into the Queen's bedroom.
Yes.
However, it became obvious at this point that the Queen and Philip were sleeping in separate beds and separate rooms. So there's that juicy little tidbit. But generally, people were very impressed with her composure.
They're royals. I wouldn't expect them to sleep in the same bed.
I would. I mean, she married him for love.
I
would. Now, they're older.
Mm-mm.
Okay, fine.
I would not. No. They are the pinnacle of the old school. Caroline, of course, they're not going to sleep in the same room.
Okay, fine. They should have twin beds.
Even worse. No.
It's very I Love Lucy. Okay, moving on.
Give me my own room. Anyway.
You can have your own room. That's fine. Should you become queen, it's yours.
Thank you. In 1981, the fairy tale wedding of the century brought the monarchy front and center in the best possible light for now.
For now.
For now. Everyone had stars in their eyes as Diana walked down the aisle in the world's puffiest dress, but it was iconic. It's everything I ever wanted.
It's hideous.
It's terrible, but listen,
It's
little girl
god-awful.
Erica loved it.
Yeah. All right. Side note, my mom actually told me that she and her friends woke up in the middle of the night in 1981, and they got all dressed up to watch this royal wedding. Mm-hmm. And I will admit to doing the same thing when Kate and William got married in 2011, but I did not bother with Harry and Meghan, so sorry, y'all.
I liked her reception dress a whole lot.
I'm not going to comment.
I didn't like the regular dress. It was just, it wasn't...
Royal.
It wasn't it. I'm sorry.
It also didn't fit.
Yeah.
Who was your tailor?
She has such amazing style in general.
I saw what she was going for with the simplicity, but it didn't work. But anyway, moving on.
So, obviously, the fairy tale with Charles and Diana did not last long, and reality really set in about who they were as people.
Literally the next day.
Who they were as people. Let's just leave it at that.
Within a few years of this fairy tale moment, 3 out of 4 of her children all got divorced, beginning with both Anne and Andrew in 1989, and then followed the hot mess of the Diana situation. As Diana said in an interview, quote, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." This was the point where the monarchy's dirty laundry was really brought out to hang on the line directly in front of the Gilded Palace with every camera focused on it.
Yep, and Charles eventually admitted on television that he'd been sleeping with Camilla since 1986 and had done so previously as well, so before the marriage. Diana was found to be having a number of affairs, and there were some very strange and racy phone calls.
Yeah, that whole tampon gate thing, what was the quote again?
Oh, God, please don't make me say it, Caroline.
Do it, say it.
Basically, he said he wished he was Camilla's tampon. Quote, "Oh God, I'll just live inside your trousers or something." Unquote. That's a real, he said it. King of England.
I want to be your tampon.
Oh. King of England. Right there for you.
Okay.
Also, dude, you should have picked a different regnal name. Charles I was beheaded, and the second one,
Yeah, Charles is not propitious. It doesn't bode well.
No one has really had a great reign that was a Charles.
We could just skip him and go right to William and Kate, and we'd all be fine.
I would have been A-okay with that. Also, I thought Princess Consort was a very fitting consolation prize for Camilla. I'm very upset
The
about
Queen Consort. And the Consort's
Queen
going to kind of
Consort.
disappear as people can see, the Queen Elizabeth versus the Queen Camilla. But anyway.
Yeah, Queen Consort is the official title, but it's not...
They keep saying it, which feels really like a dig, but I think it's just to make sure we can differentiate between the queens.
It wasn't used for Elizabeth Bowes Lyons or anything like that. They're just the Queen.
They're just the Queen. All of this drama, all this divorce, it was very embarrassing to the very traditional Queen Elizabeth. She was horrified at the idea of, in effect, humanizing the monarchy. They were meant to be above the fray, or at the very least above tampon gate-like scandal.
And I can't fault her for that.
I can see why she didn't want Charles and Diana going on national TV and just talking about their sex life.
It's not regal.
In fact, I'm pretty sure that she would be horrified. She would be horrified that we're actually discussing this within a biography of her reign. These were just things that you didn't mention previously, but they do make our top 10 list.
Yeah, listen, I hate to say it, but good old Lizzie and I have a lot in common.
I know.
There are some things we just don't talk about in this household.
There you go.
For better or for worse.
In sickness and in health.
All of this, of course, comes to a head when Diana, recently divorced, officially, dies while attempting to elude paparazzi in Paris, and disgustingly, the paparazzi continue to take her photograph amongst the wreckage as she's dying and when she dies.
Nasty. It
Just
was awful.
terrible.
They could not have done any worse.
No, you cannot sink lower than that. A
No.
special ring of hell. Tony Blair was the prime minister at the time, newly elected and very in touch. He said, quote, "She was the people's princess and she will remain there in our hearts," unquote.
But, as many of us know, the Queen wasn't as forthcoming. There was a huge public outcry that the flag over Buckingham Palace wasn't flying at half-mast. Yet it was the custom to not fly it at all when the Queen wasn't in residence. And she wasn't. She and Philip and the 2 boys, William and Harry, were at Balmoral in Scotland.
Let's take a minute to say that at that point, she doesn't have the HRH. She's not a part of the royal family anymore.
She is still the Princess of Wales. She did not lose that title.
But she doesn't have the HRH.
I can see it both ways. I can see that it is against tradition. They don't do that for anybody else.
It probably should have been done, but I understand it's not royal protocol. And I think all really, of the Queen's actions after this, it's all royal protocol. She breaks protocol to go back on TV to have this interview or this speaking out. But what's more important, going out to talk to people or making sure your grandkids are okay?
And I think she did make that clear over time. But, there was no right way to respond to this. Well, there was a preferred way.
It becomes clear to Queen Elizabeth she needs to let the public in on her grief. And while she might not have been besties with Diana, to the British people, frankly, the world, Diana was incredibly loved.
An icon.
Yeah. And whether their love and obsession with her was founded or not, you have to address it. You have to acknowledge it. And so she did. She addressed the nation after the funeral saying, quote, "May those who died rest in peace, and may we, each and every one of us, thank God for someone who made many, many people happy."
Ironically, Diana's death actually helped the monarchy's popularity. I know that feels terrible. But after the whole grieving hiccup, wherein the Queen wasn't seen to grieve, the lack of an opposing character helped Elizabeth and Philip and Charles shine a little brighter. Diana had taken a lot of that limelight, and once she wasn't there, the monarchy was able to kind of, okay, we're back.
Well, and everyone's interested in grieving people.
It's true, yeah.
Back to things. In 2002, things got pretty tough again. Once more, Princess Margaret, who had been in terrible health for quite some time, likely due to smoking at least 60 cigarettes a day,
60,
died at the age of 71. Is pretty respectable considering the strain she put on her body. Girl went hard.
She lived life to the fullest. Their relationship between the sisters was always a struggle, a back and forth between 2 very different people in 2 very different roles who still loved and cared for each other a great deal.
Yeah, and then just a month later, after insisting on attending her daughter's funeral, the Queen Mother also died at age 101. And again, amazing that she lived as long as she did, because she's well known to participate in a couple of drinks per day, if you get what I'm saying.
I think it was like a couple an hour.
Oh.
It was so many.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Her enormous funeral, which she had planned down to the last detail, a woman after my own heart, was only a few months before the Queen's Golden Jubilee celebrating 50 years on the throne.
But as this new century dawned, it became clear that Queen Elizabeth was changing with the times. She was trying to adapt. In 2005, Charles and Camilla were married, something many thought would never happen. It was a civil wedding, but as we've seen recently, it hasn't really affected her becoming queen or queen consort.
In 2011, William and Kate tied the knot before massive crowds and a very dressed up in the middle of the night Caroline. This breath of fresh air really helped the monarchy connect with younger generations. And then in 2012, the Olympics were held in London, and Elizabeth officially opened them herself, as well as appearing in a brief film with Daniel Craig as James Bond, which was adorable. So, again, she's connecting and remaining relevant. But let me tell you, Elizabeth and Philip were always at the front, spearheading the modernization of the monarchy.
Yeah.
If it were up to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, those gates would have always been locked at Buckingham. Raise them higher.
Stop looking at us. We are above your eye.
Yes.
Sight privilege.
Yes,
I agree. And then last, there was the Harry and Meghan wedding, 2018. Do we want to comment?
My only comment is that I do think Meghan faced some outright racism from the press. I do think she probably felt it in the family, but I don't think her Oprah interview, for me, I did not find it very heartwarming. And then to say, I didn't even Google my husband. Okay, sure you didn't.
Bullshit.
Her saying, I didn't really expect to have to curtsy to the Queen.
Bullshit. It's very Charles and Diana, early 90s, airing so much dirty laundry. And I'm a fan of leaving social media to be positive things and not to encourage every small thing in your life, every sadness being blown up. I like the idea of being able to regulate emotions internally and then just chill. But she did not seem to understand what marrying into the royal family meant. And I'm really sorry for her on that. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do that, but I didn't make that choice. And she did. And then she was like, I want to change all the rules.
Right.
And that's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout history, royals have bucked at the restrictions within being a monarch. And one of the things that Queen Elizabeth II did better than almost anyone else was she towed the line.
Mm-hmm.
She understood what her job was. She knew what she represented. And she,
yes,
to the very last day, was a regal queen.
Yes. Moving on.
A year and a half before his wife, Prince Philip, passed away in April of last year at the age of 99. The ages.
They are just long-lived folks. I personally think they drink so much gin, they're a little bit pickled, but that's also just me.
I could deal with that.
So, as we've said, Elizabeth followed him less than a week ago at the age of 96, and I think she went out on a high. Mm-hmm. She began her reign immensely popular, saw it through a lot of bumpy years, and then honestly weathered about a decade of distinctly unpleasant times wherein the press wanted dirt. It didn't matter if it was real or not, and the monarchy chose to just take it. She does seem to have pulled back the public's appreciation in the last decade or so, and I think from absolutely no real knowledge beyond the headlines, it's the next generations which have helped her to stay young, stay relevant, and stay popular.
All right, so we have covered her long reign. We went quickly through it because we want to take a look at our top 10 highlights.
All right, Caroline, I want you to start us off with number 10.
Her bright fashion choices. I think that the colors she chose were hideous, but I know that they were for a purpose.
Security.
While they might seem frivolous, it is an actual mark of how she viewed her role as queen. She dedicated her life, her person, to the country, and she chose clothes that made her stand out. She thought if one of her subjects waited in line in the rain to catch a glimpse, then by golly, they'd spot her.
Mm-hmm.
She always chose to wear bright colors, yellows and greens and
lime
pinks.
greens.
And she did this throughout her reign. Lime greens with a big matching hat. Didn't really seem to like Prince very much.
Which is fine by me.
She really embraced this notion of she was there to be seen. And she understood that as a figurehead, you've got to let people see her. And I like that.
Yeah.
Maybe she liked these colors, but if not, then by golly, she made a big sacrifice because they are bright.
Mm-hmm. They're loud. Number 9, it has to be for me her sense of humor. And there are a ton of cute little stories out there, but I got this one from the Nat Geo Kids page, and it is so cute. She once went on, in her older years, she went on a trip to Scotland. She loved Scotland, had plenty of properties up there. And she was taking a walk, and she met some American tourists while she was out on this walk. And the tourist asked her if she lived locally, and she meant it just casually that she had a house nearby. Probably a palace, but whatever. And then so they asked, well, hey, have you ever met the Queen? She has a palace around here. The Queen simply pointed at her security guard and says, I haven't ever met her, but he has.
What kind of tourists were these that they did not recognize her? Her face is plastered on every teacup in that country. You cannot get away from that face.
Everywhere.
Also, she had a security team.
But What a great sense of humor, right?
She had a security team.
Yeah.
You know who doesn't?
Me.
People who randomly just live in the country and are going for a walk. You know who does? The Queen going for a walk.
Maybe they were just dressed casually.
Well, she was. I mean, she was an outdoors woman.
No. The security.
I'm still going to say that when a 90-year-old woman goes for a walk, she doesn't generally have 3 35-year-old strapping men wearing casual clothes following.
Yeah, fair.
But I like the sense of humor. I'm mostly making fun of the idiot.
I mean, yes, that's true.
Number 8. The abdication crisis. This changed Elizabeth's world forever. When her uncle, Edward VIII, said that he chose to marry for love and would give up his throne, it meant that her father immediately became the King of England, and she went from having a pretty normal childhood to a total change in perspective. It instilled her with an understanding of duty first and happiness second, something that she pretty much always held to, I think with the exception of marrying Prince Philip, because he really wasn't the best choice.
He was not.
And it's something that she always required of her children, for better or worse.
Indeed.
Number 7, the dress.
We are talking about Elizabeth's wedding dress. I love this little factoid. She got married in 1947, which is right after World War II. And so it was the first royal major event held after the Second World War. Of course, the dress was designed by one of her favorite court designers, Norman Hartnell. It had this beautiful star-patterned fan-shaped bridal train that was 13 feet long. And if you remember, you're still rationing at this point because you have to recover from a world war.
Everybody was on rations. There was still very limited amounts of food and clothing.
And so she was required by the government to keep her ration tickets so that she could pay for her dress. Now, they did grant her a whole 200 more, and what I thought is just absolutely amazing. Women around the country sent hundreds of clothing coupons to help her acquire the dress.
She didn't take them, though, correct?
No, they're non-transferable. So she ended up sending them back. But, guys, who would do that? I wouldn't.
What a great sense
It's just such an indication of how well loved
I think so, too.
she was. And what a symbol of hope that the wedding was. Now, just to get some more details, which I love, it was delivered in a 4-foot squared box because it needed to stand. It was inspired by Botticelli's Primavera. It had jasmine, smilax, lilac, white rose, orange blossoms, pearl seeds.
Was inspired by spring, a reawakening, which is how they viewed Elizabeth's reign as a new Elizabethan era, dawning of a new age.
Yep.
I like it.
And the silk was not purchased from Japan or fascist Italy. It was purchased from nationalist China because they would not give Japan and Italy.
Oh, that's valid.
I can understand that.
We just fought you in a world war. We're not going to give you some money.
No money for you.
That leads us to number 6. We talked about the dress. Now let's talk about the marriage. Fun fact, Elizabeth and Philip are third cousins, meaning they share great-grandparents. And if the Pope was here, he would say that's not within the laws of consanguinity. Basically,
6 degrees of separation.
They're very closely related. It's possible that they'd actually met earlier in their youth at family weddings or events, but the first known meeting was in 1939 at Dartmouth, weeks before the war began. The royal family was visiting the Naval College, and Philip, just 18, handsome, outgoing, he was assigned by his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, to show them around because his uncle, who was also related to Queen Elizabeth, was hoping to kind of do a little matchmaking. He was a father figure to Philip, and he thought, wouldn't it be great if this kid that I'm kind of molding ended up being a prince to the country? And it worked. She was 13 13, and she was instantly smitten.
But 5 years, for whatever reason, I thought they were farther apart.
According to her governess's memoir, Elizabeth, quote, never took her eyes off him. Philip, on the other hand, was simply entertaining a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old princess. The trio actually just really played tennis. But Elizabeth was determined, so throughout the war, she and Philip exchanged letters, and when he was home on leave, he was a constant visitor at the palace. Previously uninterested in makeup and hair, Elizabeth suddenly took extreme care when Philip was expected for a visit. Queen-to-be or not, girlhood crushes can be all-consuming. Philip proved himself brave and capable during the war, and King George VI, a Navy man himself, was very impressed by Philip's war record. So when Elizabeth asked to get engaged, he agreed with the caveat that they wait until she turned 21. He wanted a little bit more family time, and he wanted to make sure she was sure. The Queen Mother, however, wasn't sure. She referred to him as Philip the Hun, a man whose German connections made her very nervous because, as we said, his sisters were married to Nazis, and his original last name was Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksberg.
It's a long one.
Think about having to spell that in kindergarten. Upon their engagement, Philip changed his last name to Mountbatten, wisely, and he also renounced his titles and converted from Greek Orthodox to Anglican. The country was not entirely behind her decision. His German connections were problematic, as was his modernity. Prince Philip wasn't simpering and respectful. He was a bit cheeky. He liked to joke, and he refused to be anyone but himself. He was seen as not one of them, though upon receiving a pretty condescending tour of Buckingham Palace and its history, he did dryly reply that his mother had actually been born there. Mic drop.
Love that.
This is our fabulous Buckingham Palace. It was built in blah, 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 blah. And he's like, yeah, I know. My mom was born here. I'm not an idiot. I'm one of you.
There was a scene in
The Crown.
The Crown
Yep.
where he's like, yeah, my great-grandmother is Victoria, too. Everyone seems to forget that.
Yeah, a little bit of a middle finger.
Mm-hmm.
But to Elizabeth, he represented normal. He was fun. He was handsome. And he treated her like a woman, not like a queen, and I can imagine that that was a breath of fresh air. And so Elizabeth, ironically making a choice for herself that she did not allow other members of the family to make, married for love. The wedding was in November of 1947. Many of the royal family were concerned that a resplendent wedding would be inappropriate considering the post-war hardships, but the press promoted the wedding, and they seemed to understand that the public was excited to have an escape from this difficult post-war life. In terms of family life, Philip was always the head of the family. He was also the dominant one in the relationship, but politically, Elizabeth was the queen, the sovereign, and above him. And that put their whole thing in a bit of a tight spot.
My God, it's the 50s. It's the 40s and the 50s.
Yep. Number 5. We come to it. The Diana situation.
All right. It was a huge part of Elizabeth's headache and annus horribilis, the horrible year. But here's what I want to say about it. It was terrible, terrible, terrible for the crown, the firm, all of it. And probably extremely disrupting for everyone's personal life, too.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, I don't think Elizabeth or any of the royal family knew how to give Diana what she craved. Family life that we think of as normal today. And I just don't know that the House of Windsor was equipped to accommodate that. Now, I think that she did a fantastic job with raising her boys and giving them more normal experiences and things like that. I mean, she was 19. She was a child.
Yep.
You
and
know,
he was
and
33. She was 19 and he was 33. And in love with another woman. Obviously so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any winning this.
Yeah.
Not to speak ill of the dead.
No.
But I think that the family in general should have rethought this decision.
Yes.
Asking someone to fall out of love with a woman and to fall in love with someone who was not very well educated. Like, Diana was a nice girl, but she was not brilliant. She was not well educated. And Charles is very smart.
In the traditional sense.
He wanted to discuss Shakespeare, and she didn't know much about Shakespeare. he tried to tutor her, and she was like, nah, I thought we were going to have sexy time. It was a bad combo.
Yeah, it was not a good match.
Number 4 is Elizabeth's coronation. 16 months after the death of her father, Elizabeth finally was crowned. It was delayed in large part because Westminster Abbey was under construction at the time. Philip, likely to pacify him, was made chairman of the committee to plan the ceremony, but he was pretty much the only one pushing for modernization. For example, TV. He wanted to televise this historic moment, and for that, sir, we do thank you. But the Queen was very traditional, and the Archbishop of Canterbury thought it would, quote, make the sacred into a spectacle. Which, of course, is what a coronation really is, a spectacle. The Queen Mother was also against it. However, the press caught wind of this debate, and they had an opinion. Let the people see the Queen, read the headlines. And so eventually Elizabeth agreed. You can already see the relationship between Philip and Elizabeth here, and honestly, it mirrors Albert and Victoria in some very obvious ways. While the coronation was meant to be grand, it was a bit of a tightrope walk. As Winston Churchill said, quote, can't have coronations with bailiffs in the house. So they did try to be sparing where they could, but not in her dress. Just like her wedding gown, her coronation gown was full of symbolism. William Hartnell, who made her wedding dress, also made her coronation gown. The embroidery included plants from every part of the Commonwealth to include the Tudor rose, oh so fitting, maple leaf, hi Canada, thistle for Scotland, a leek for Wales, maybe? I'm not sure about the leek. Shamrock for Ireland, something called a wattle, which is an Australian plant. Any Australian listeners, do tell us what that is. A silver fern, protea for South Africa, the lotus flowers of India, wheat, cotton, and jute. I love the symbolism, it's all there. She also chose to wear the St. Edward's crown, which is super, super, super heavy, but is the one that men have always worn. Queen Victoria did not, however. She only wore the imperial state crown, but Queen Elizabeth II was determined. She was slightly taller than Queen Victoria, and so she was gonna wear it. She actually practiced for days in advance to help adjust to the weight. A new dish was invented called coronation chicken, which sounds a lot like curry chicken salad to me, with raisins. It was raining. Churchill came in uniform and looked very flashy, as he loved to do. And, most excitingly, many of the ceremonial events harken back to the days of Dunstan in 973. So, for us chroniclers, it was a pretty awesome moment to watch history in the making mirror and reflect histories of the past. The only bit that wasn't shown on TV was the anointing with holy oil of her head and heart. She was under a canopy for this sacred moment, likely because the Archbishop was really annoyed by the whole television thing. Now on to number 3, the number of prime ministers.
Okay, this one was a really fun one for me because I found this great Town and Country article, which is linked in the show notes. And it has her encounters with presidents and prime ministers. So first, let's start with prime ministers, because she had 15 prime ministers and met 13 presidents.
I know she ruled 70 years, but that's still a lot.
Here we go. Starting off with Winston Churchill as her first.
I mean, if you're gonna have a first.
Hello, Winston. Anthony Eden as her second. Third, Harold Macmillan. Then Alec Douglas Home, followed by Harold Wilson, which we talked about earlier. Then Edward Heath, followed by James Callaghan. Of course, Margaret Thatcher. Pretty iconic there.
Hey there, Mags.
Then John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron. Then Theresa May, the second female prime minister, Boris Johnson, and she was able to welcome in her final prime minister, Liz Truss, just last week. So now we move to president. Honestly, I had such a great time with this NPR article. Please check it out. It's awesome. She came to America several times. The first time was to meet President Harry Truman. She was only 25 years old. And she was there with her husband to represent her father. And just a few months later, she'd be crowned queen. Her next trip to America was in 1957, where she was hosted by Dwight Eisenhower. And I'll send you this picture right quick because she and Mamie Eisenhower are dressed in almost the exact dress. It is absolutely wild.
Oh, I got it. That is very similar. It's like when you show up to the prom and two girls have chosen the same dress.
Yes. It is the same, almost the same pattern. It is a different material. The Queen's is obviously embroidered and has beading of some description, and Mamie's
It's the same dress.
It's this pattern. It's a very, muted pattern. I like it a lot, but it is the exact same dress. Then, of course, John F. Kennedy comes to Buckingham Palace, which, of course, is a big part of the crown, so I'm just going to skip over that. She does not meet with Johnson.
Interesting.
And there's no official word as to why. I like to think she just didn't like him.
There you go. We're going to make that a...
Maybe she was worried he was going to pull out his Johnson, which he was known to do.
Quite famous
But
for.
then picked back up with Gerald Ford, and he said this to her, quote, "Your Majesty, the wounds of our parting in 1776 healed long ago. Americans admire the United Kingdom as one of our truest allies and best friends." I feel like you could not have the whole 1776 bit, but okay.
Do you have to bring up the lack of an empire? It seems tactless.
It's not it.
To me.
Her response was, "History is not a fairy tale. What is more important is that our shared language and tradition in history has given us common vision for what is right and what is just." So elegant.
She is an elegant woman.
She went horseback riding with Ronald Reagan at Windsor Castle. He later welcomed the royal couple to their home in San Francisco. George H.W. Bush entertained the Queen by taking her to see America's pastime, a Major League Baseball game, the Orioles.
Ooh.
And Elizabeth met Bill Clinton, guess how many times?
5?
3.
Oh.
But still,
Three
3 times.
I bet they talked on the phone weekly. She was like, "Hey, Bill." And he was like, "Oh my gosh, Liz, what's going on?"
Liz, what's up?
What's up, lady?
And so George W. Bush then went to the palace in 2003, but it was a very low-key visit as far as state visits go because there was a lot of controversy with the war in Iraq. It was so tight that Bush did not have any contact with the British people.
Interesting.
4 years later, she would go to the White House for a dinner. Bush started to tell the audience that the Queen had been there for the bicentennial in 1976, but of course flubbed and said 1776.
Whoops.
Thank you so much, George Bush.
Every woman wants to be 200 years older.
Yes.
Well done.
And then, of course, she met the Obamas, which was great. And, of course, there was a lot of attention given when Donald Trump walked in front of her at the inspection of the guard when he visited in 2018.
We're going to leave that there.
You know, I will...
Walk away. Walk away.
We're going to leave it there. She would meet President Biden before her death, and he, of course, in true Biden nature, tried to give a compliment and failed. Biden told reporters that she had been gracious and that she reminded him a bit of his own mother. I would like to say to the president, she is only 16 years older than you are.
Let's don't make her a teenage mother. Back off.
Let's not get too many ideas.
Woof.
Yeah, she is the Queen of England.
Okay, now we're on to her World War II service. Number 2.
Oh my gosh.
So much to say.
She's phenomenal. A World War II veteran. Of course, the government wanted the royal family safe. They were going to send them to Canada. The royal family said absolutely not. The reigning king and queen, George VI and Elizabeth, stayed in Buckingham Palace and sent Margaret and Elizabeth away to Windsor, about 20 miles outside of London. And this was common. They were sending their children up to the country so they could get out of the Blitz.
They were just like every other family that was trying to protect their children while staying themselves to protect the home front. It was impressive.
Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons is quoted as saying that she was happy that the palace had been bombed, and now she can actually look the East End in the eye.
Yep. Yeah, I love that quote. That's a great one.
It does ring true. War affects everyone, and to be able to say it's affected my home life too, and I was just as scared.
Yep.
It's a big statement. Elizabeth was just 13 years old when the war broke out in 1939. So her first official radio broadcast was a part of the BBC's Children's Hour, and it was an attempt to boost public morale. It's so precious. She spoke directly to children who had been separated from their families. And although she had not been separated in quite the same situation, it was still a separation.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all. To you, living in new surroundings, we send a message of true sympathy, and at the same time, we would like to thank the kind people who have welcomed you to their homes in the country.
And I believe in the show notes we are able to link the actual video.
Yep, it's gonna be linked.
Like, that's heartwarming, but she also, on the morning of her 16th birthday, Princess Elizabeth undertook her first inspection of a military regiment during a parade at Windsor. She had been given the role of honorary colonel of the Grenadier Guards, which symbolized her military involvement in the war. When she turned 18, she insisted upon joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. When she joined, she was not given special rank. She started as a second subaltern in the ATS and was later promoted to junior commander, which is the equivalent of a captain for our Army Marine Corps. The newspapers dubbed her the Princess Auto Mechanic because she dealt with vehicle maintenance at Aldershot.
Fun fact, she was a very fast driver her entire life, and she actually had to officially apologize to some of the families that lived near her at Balmoral for driving 60 plus miles an hour on their private roads and scaring the bejesus out of them. Woman liked her cars, and I think that's awesome. She also liked her horses and her cows.
She did. She continued on a precedent of military service for the royal family, but I think it was great that she didn't do some highfalutin job at the top of the food chain. She was down there with regular women, and she was an auto mechanic.
Down and dirty. The work that had to be done.
Of course, now, or just a few weeks ago, her final rank was Colonel-in-Chief of 16 British Army regiments and corps and many Commonwealth units.
Awesome.
She was the first female of the royal family to be an active duty member and the last surviving head of state to have served in the Second World War.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
Another legacy gone.
And that leads us to our number one. And this was my request to make number one. So if you disagree, don't blame Erica.
Thank you.
But number one for us was the relationship between Margaret and Elizabeth. I love the dichotomy. The sisters were born 3 years apart. They were very close as a young family. We four, they were very knit together. But they were so different. You can see, starting at age 10, when Elizabeth realizes that she is going to become the Queen of England, the dichotomy really starts to shed light on Elizabeth's regalness, the expectations that she carries, and how she had to set herself apart and was set apart by others. I think it's worth looking into to show her dedication, her commitment, her resolve. But it's also quite sad for Margaret, because she had to, at a very young age, understand that she was always less in some ways, and that she was never going to be allowed to be her own person. She was always going to be part of the monarchy. She was always going to have these expectations, but she was never going to have the honors that Elizabeth would get. She would never have the freedoms that Elizabeth would have. She was going to have to live in her sister's world, boxed in forever. Margaret said, quote, "It was inevitable when there are two sisters and one is the queen who must be the source of honor and all that is good, while the other must be the focus of the most creative malice, the evil sister." Margaret was also just a very different person, as we talked about. She liked to be the center of attention. At some point, their governess had to tell George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, you really shouldn't invite Margaret to things anymore. Because Margaret would be the center of attention and Elizabeth would get to kind of shy in the background. And so eventually, Margaret wasn't invited to things because she shone too much. And that sucks for Elizabeth because she had to step up her game. And it sucks for Margaret because rude.
Mm-hmm. When you're not a naturally extroverted, shiny person, like, that's uncomfortable. Having to do something that is not in your natural character is uncomfortable.
It's so uncomfortable.
And it's sad that you have to do it as a child.
I agree. Yeah, from such a young age. Margaret's carefree ways were initially very popular. She really did well in the 60s and the 70s when things were modernizing, and people really felt for her that she wanted to marry for love and wasn't able to. Everybody felt her constrictions. However, as she aged, the carefreeness didn't go over as well. She just didn't grow up in the same way that you would expect, probably because she was placed in this box and just couldn't get out of it. But as she got older, her heavy drinking, her heavy smoking...
An older woman who is sex positive, having these affairs, making these choices that something you're expecting of a 20, 30-year-old. And that's sexist, because who cares if a man does it? But the fact that she...
It is. But no, I think people don't like watching a 60-year-old man either get drunk and smoke and sleep around. Like, it's just not...
But it's also more accepted.
It's ageist.
But if it's a woman, oh, she's a lush. She's making a fool of herself again. Why can't she comport herself in a certain way? Like, it is. It's ageist and it's sexist.
But it is true that it did not look well for her, and that the press really bit into her for that after a while. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing between them was this marriage fiasco. While Elizabeth did get to pick her German-Greek prince, Margaret wasn't allowed to choose the very upstanding British World War II pilot who was divorced, but he was the injured party.
Yeah, he was not at fault.
He was not at fault for this divorce. And so it is unfair. Like, at the end of the day, that was unfair. I don't know if there was any way to ever avoid complete resentment between these two girls because of their unique positions that they were put in almost from birth. And I honestly would have said that William and Harry managed it pretty well up until recently. There's been some tension.
Yeah, up until recently.
But it is a very hard place to put these girls.
And yet again, it's an American divorcee.
Yeah. Nature versus nurture. You have to wonder what would have happened had they been switched. Had Margaret been the firstborn, had her personality been allowed to shine and continue to shine, would she have aged more gracefully? Would she have stepped up to the plate? Or was Elizabeth born first because that really just... Was she the right person for the right time? And I think she was. I think Margaret would have struggled.
I think her personality was much more suited. I don't think that Margaret would have thrived with that much of a high-stakes environment.
And you see that throughout history.
And I think that's proven by her drug and alcohol abuse.
That's true. You see that throughout history where some monarchs really were able to adapt and to make the most of it, and some monarchs just completely butted heads the whole way and hated it from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And so, with that, we are going to leave the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. We wanted to bring this to you guys today because it is such an important time in history. We're excited to see what King Charles III is going to do.
I mean, speak for yourself. I'm not excited.
Maybe he'll surprise us.
I will say he is way more forward-thinking.
He is.
And more open about his political stances. And that's interesting.
I think it's going to be a new ball game.
And he's much more liberal than you would think.
Because she was the last of her reserved...
It is an end of a way of life and an end of an era.
The monarchy is no longer going to be untouchable.
Well, I don't know that it's...
And it wasn't really before.
There will no longer be the veil dividing. She was the end of the veil. And there's no way to reinstate it. Charles broke that whenever he went on television to talk about his sex life.
Yeah.
That was the end of that. And she's the end of the era.
That's fair. That was the end of that. Thank you for joining us today. If you haven't listened to us before, if you're just coming to us for this lovely historical update, then please go back and look through our library. We've got some really great episodes on hugely important and sometimes completely forgotten members of history. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, so please follow us at the Pithy Chronicle. And with that, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Erica. And we are pithily yours.
This episode is brought to you by the Pithy Chronicle, LLC. The Pithy Chronicle is intended for education, entertainment, and non-commercial purposes. Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the owner may or may not be associated with in a professional or personal capacity. While we offer lots of sarcasm, this podcast does not offer any advice or services. Listening to this podcast may induce fits of laughter, unexpected distraction, or uncontrollable rage at the subjects, hopefully not at us. We hope you learned something today. If not, so sorry. Please be advised we are not experts in the following fields: medical, legal, financial, technological, thermonuclear engineering, submarine warfare, neuroscience, or cat husbandry. Thanks for listening to our little disclaimer. Just covering our history-loving asses. Bye!